I'm Evan Gudmstead, an instructor of application web development at Rankin Technical College. In today's tutorial, I'm going to make improvements to the built-in Swagger documentation in ASP.NET Core to improve this RESTful APIs documentation. And so in a recent video, I just made a very simple REST API that can do CRUD operations. I'll go ahead and link to that video in order to do CRUD operations on pizza. And so you can kind of see here the documentation that comes out of the gate for free with this Swagger UI to be able to begin to understand a new API. It helps to read its documentation. And so I think it's incredible that you get all this documentation, quote unquote, for free. This is a great starting point. However, there are some steps that you can take to actually make this documentation better. And you know, for me, using the template, using the weather forecast, when you bring in a template, there's this weather forecast method. And it didn't do a great job of explaining the API documentation, didn't do a great job of explaining what that method did. So I can relate to this because the out-of-the-box documentation was a little short. It came up a little short in explaining the purpose of a particular method. I had to actually dig into the code and poke around a little bit to begin to understand it at a deeper level. So I think it can be very beneficial to make these slight improvements. And here's how we're going to do it. So again, the starting point is a RESTful API that I kind of spun up that does CRUD operations. If I look at my Solution Explorer, this is a controller-based API. I have a pizza controller. And where we're going to start, there's a couple basically one-liners here that we're going to add to program CS. And we're going to replace this line 8, where it says add Swagger gen. That add Swagger gen, builds that web interface that we were just looking at for free. And we're just going to update this method call with some details. Okay, now I'm going to copy and paste and we can kind of walk through this. This is the first step. We're just modifying this Swagger gen method to have some additional detail. So you're going to notice it's the same method, but it accepts now some additional information. So kind of have a lambda expression here where we have this variable c.swagger.doc, and we can generate a what's called the version 1 of our documentation. And you know, some of the terminology, man, it really, as I've gone through tutorials on this, whether it's called Swagger or Open API, you can almost use the two terms interchangeably. But Open API is the kind of the standard, and then Swagger is the implementation of that standard. But again, I think of it like JavaScript is the implementation of the ECMAScript standard. So a lot of times you see people see ECMAScript and JavaScript, they use those terms interchangeably. So very similar kind of in that sense. But here you can kind of just, see here what I did, which I just say, this is the version 1 of my documentation. This is my pizza API. You can offer all this additional information that will go into the documentation of your Swagger web page that will be generated. So again, giving it a title, giving it a description, if you want to give it some sort of terms of service, contact information, right? So here's a little bit of my contact info. Of course, I can put my name, my email, maybe my website kind of in this documentation. And then ultimately, the comments that we're going to add will be added to an XML file. So we're going to be adding some comments ultimately we're going to comment our code that will be used in the documentation. And so where to actually store those comments, this is just kind of a relative path that will put it kind of in a folder in the project and put it in an XML file. Okay, so basically where will you store the comments in an XML format? Okay, so this is kind of the first step to making improvements to our HTTP. Now the second step, we're going to scroll down and we're going to update this method call, which is use Swagger UI. So I'm going to replace that one method call to use the JSON file located in the V1 folder and a title of my API V1. Okay, so step one, step two, okay, just following these steps. Step three, and this is a little bit different, right? It's pretty normal to modify program CS and kind of change the methods that you call in there. However, I found this one to be a little bit different. You have to actually make a modification to the solution file itself. So you're going to notice here, if I click on Contoso Pizza, this is actually the .sln file, not the CS proj. Let me show you what I mean. Not the SLN, the CS proj file. If I right click and open this in File Explorer, okay, it's going to take it to the location. This is my CS proj file. If I open up that CS proj file in Notepad or Notepad++, this is that CS proj file. Okay, so that's what we're looking at when we click the project itself. Okay, so we're actually going to add 2 lines of code right here to generate documentation file, and this will kind of suppress some warnings. Click on save, and that will modify that CS proj file. So those are the 3 steps needed, and now we can start adding some documentation to our endpoints. Okay, let me go ahead and close. And if I were to boot this up at this point, this is what we would see. We can actually see some of the new documentation, a terms of service link, okay, my information with the website that I linked to in my source code, good old mail to link and anchor tag that's a mail to, that'll mail to my email address. So we can actually begin to see it's improving the documentation already, but we have not made any improvements to the endpoints. Okay, so if we boot it up there, this is kind of its current state. Now, how to actually make improvements to our endpoints is the next step. Now, this is going to be done with commenting our code with XML. And so XML comments. And so let me close program CS and kind of get to our controller endpoints. And so for example here, this is where we are getting a pizza by its ID. And if it's a valid ID and it returns that ID, it'll return a pizza object. Otherwise, it returns a 404 not found. Okay, so this is going to be where we actually write some comments that will be used by Swagger to improve that web page and to improve the documentation. And let me pull up some of the code snippets that we could potentially use. Okay, I just wanted to kind of use a little ChatGPT summary of what are the different XML tags that we could use in commenting our code. Okay, there's a summary tag. We'll use many of these, if not all of them. We're going to use a summary XML tag, a param tag, a returns. So a summary, high-level description. A param describes an input parameter. Returns, what is a return data type out of the method. In this case, the input is an int, an ID. The output would be a pizza. Remarks are really useful to include additional details, such as what an example request would look like and what an example response would look like. So I found remarks to be really useful. Response codes are what possible response status codes. So these are HTTP status codes 200, 202, 404, etc. What are the different status codes that could be thrown? Any potential exceptions that could be thrown? And then basically any data types that that the method might be interacting with or working with. Okay, so these are Swagger XML tags that we're going to use here to update our API with. So let's start with, and I have I'm going to start with the get by ID. Okay, and I'll start with, and you're going to see how this is done. So here, I'm going to remove my comment. I'm going to start with the summary tag. So this is just a regular comment, and inside of the comment, you've got an XML tag. Okay, XML is a really flexible language that allows all sorts of made-up tags. And it's often defined by what's called an XML schema. And so what are the allowable tags are defined in what's called an XML schema. Suffice to say, this is an allowable tag, the summary. It says it returns a specific pizza based on the ID. So I'm just going to add that, right? So I'm just going to add this one XML comment. And if I come back, let's see if it was good enough to pick it up on the fly. A lot of times it's not. Let me close. Not quite good enough to pick it up on the fly and reboot. Okay, and you could see, again, just a little bit of additional information. So you could see where that got picked up at when we added the summary. So that's nice that Swagger picked up on that. So let's add a parameter, right? Parameter name ID. So here's another comment. Okay, so here's a tag called param name of ID, the ID of the pizza in the list. Pretty straightforward. Let's reboot and see how that gets added in. Sometimes they gotta close everything. So obviously this is an input parameter. Come on. Okay, now we have the description of the input ID, the ID of the pizza in the list. Okay, so again, just a little bit better description on what the ID is. Let's look at a returns. So here's where we see is responses. Again, this was pre-built. So let me close. And now we're saying it returns the pizza JSON. And maybe I'm overlooking it, but I'm actually not seeing where that returns was all that useful. However, another way of doing that is with remarks. So I didn't see the returns, and maybe I overlooked it or whatnot. But here, okay, here's a remarks tag. And the remarks tag is pretty useful. I could say, hey, in my sample request, I'm going to hit this endpoint. So this is a REST API endpoint, get API/pizza1, so it's a normal request. An example response is going to respond with the JSON ID of 1, name margarita, price $10.99. Okay, and this is all inside of a remarks tag. So I did not see where it said the pizza JSON. However, this is an example response, is going to do the same thing, and I found that to be pretty nice. Okay, so here you could see the sample request. This was not here before. An example response, that was not there before. So pretty cool. You know, again, improving this documentation. Couple more, actually, 2 or 3 more. The response tag, as we walk through this. Response tag. So, okay, the response says, hey, this can respond with 200 or 404. Okay, and basically not found would return the 404, and if I actually return the data, that's when we're going to get a status code of 200, which says returns the pizza object, or if the ID is not valid in the list, it'll return 404. And here is the 200 returns the pizza object, and 404 if the pizza is not valid in the list. So updating the responses, this 404 was not there before. And this description was not there before. So again, making those improvements. And there's one more where it's like, hey, in general, this is working with the type of, the data type of pizza. And I believe what that piece did here is this example value of schema, where it actually picks up the pizza type was added in with an ID, which tells us our data types on these attributes. So all that's good. Couple more things, and then we'll talk about attributes. Actually, no, let's talk about attributes now. So, okay, so here's an attribute on this method that says, hey, there's going to be an input to this method. This ID, it should be resolved to an input parameter. We can also add these attributes of produces response type of 200 and 404. So it mimics this response code up here. This attribute does. And so again, this just more or less, these are the types of HTTP response codes. And so I thought that was a good attribute to add to our methods. And we might get some redundancy here with these attributes because it already has the responses of 200 and 404. I don't know that we are getting any additional documentation on this web page by those attributes. but it was there in the tutorial, so I brought it over. Now, if I bring it and try it out, and I throw in ID of 1, and I click execute, we're getting back 200. That was our response body. And if I say pizza 3, it says 404, not found. We only had 2 pizzas in our list. Okay, and so that's, more or less a shorter video on how to improve the documentation. I'm going to go ahead and bring over many other of the methods, such as a create, and I'll put all of these. Again, it's a summary, a parameter, so we're taking an input pizza, returns the created pizza, response code 201, response code 204, and again I put their produces response type. Save that, and now you can see the improved docs on the create or the add method. And last couple more. After create, we have delete and update. So our delete will go here. A summary and input, returns no content, response code 204 or 404. And update by ID. So here's our update with a summary, an input. This actually has 2 inputs, an ID and a pizza that you're updating. It returns no content. If it's successful, 204, 400, 404, all valid response codes, the way we have implemented that method. And boot it up one last time. And all of our docs have been updated, so it's not terribly hard to get this documentation improved. I think it's a beneficial process anytime you're working with a RESTful API to have good documentation on that API that you're creating. The last one is get all, right? So I would invite you as an exercise to update the documentations on the get all pizzas on this last route, just as a way to get your hands on the keyboard and get you typing and get you thinking. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on updating your API.